Hello, and welcome to episode 507 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Paridon, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum. And with me, as always, is my co host, esteemed author and historian and good buddy, Jon Parshall. How are you, John?
I'm very well, man. Nice to see you again,
As always, as always. And look, I didn't screw up the intro like I
like
did for the
last time.
one that I
That was
totally left in
beautiful.
the episode, by the way.
Completely. Why wouldn't you?
Absolutely. Why not? Why not? And you guys are sitting there going, what are you talking about? You're going to actually see that in 2 weeks, but still, it's
Yep,
good to go.
exactly.
So we got a pretty interesting thing to talk about here, John. This is one of those battles, and I'll get to the intro and then we'll get into the thing. But it's one of those battles that people kind of know on the periph, but they don't really
Yep.
know a whole lot about, and it's confusing because there's
It's
not a
long,
really, yeah, it is.
long, and
And
there's yet not a lot of Western source material on it, but it's fought at the ends of the earth and hugely important, and nobody's heard of it. So,
big time, big time. So
yeah,
let's get into it. In 1931, as we know, Japan invaded Manchuria following the false flag event at Mukden. Since then, the renegade Kwangtung Army had pursued numerous other incidents, as the Japanese called them, to both the south and the north. In 1939, the Kwangtung Army still occupied Manchuria, or as the Japanese called it, Manchukuo. Bordering the puppet state of Manchukuo, at its very northern extremities, was the Soviet protectorate of Outer Mongolia. Mistrust, severe mistrust, between the two former enemies of the 1905 Russo-Japanese War had led to a very tense border situation, and in fact, several more incidents had sparked along the border, which happened to be disputed. Big surprise here. The Japanese said the border ran along this line, the Soviets said it ran along another line. With the situation between the two opposing sides already tense, and a border that was about as clear as mud, bad things were bound to happen, and bad things did happen. Riding a wave of seeming invincibility, the Imperial Japanese Army, specifically the Kwangtung Army, felt it could do no wrong. And in the event of a showdown with their former 1905 enemies, the Kwangtung Army would mop the floor with the people they claimed, quote, had a despicable urge to live, unquote. But as the saying goes, the enemy always gets a vote. And the Soviet vote against the Kwangtung Army in 1939 carried the weight of a 20-pound sledge to the face. The events that transpired at Nomonhan, or Khalkhin Gol, as the Soviets called it, in 1939 had a far-reaching effect that spread through the remainder of the Pacific War. And I
yeah,
don't believe that is an
yeah.
overestimation of
It's
its,
true. It's
yeah.
absolutely true. And just such a fascinating fight because again it is so obscure and fought in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, I finally, this morning had to, go build some maps for myself, and we'll show some of those off. But this little fracas is going to happen at the very far eastern tip of Mongolia, along this incredibly long border between Manchukuo and the Soviet Union and Mongolia, which sort of we've got two puppet states, going at
Yes.
it. That's kind of what's happening here. But the bottom line is that there's this 3,000-mile long border, which just that number in and of itself is just kind of jaw dropping to think
Yeah.
about. Um, and it
3,000-mile disputed border, too, by
disputed
the
border.
way. It's not
Exactly.
like a 20-mile space it's disputed. 3,000-mile, as Rich Frank says, vaguely defined,
Yes.
which means that there was no
Yeah.
concrete definition, or at least by any side.
Right. Yeah, and that
So,
the nub of the matter that here in the eastern tip of Mongolia, there are two competing definitions of what that line is. The Japanese are
right.
claiming that it runs along the Khalkhin River, and the Soviets claim that no, it's further east, and they've got this sort of imaginary line drawn in the imaginary sand that meets at this little village called Nomonhan, and
Mhm.
that's where they say the border is. And so that kind of sets the stage for what we're going to be talking about here.
And not surprisingly, each side differed where the border was, yet nobody did anything about it before this. Like nobody thought let's have an idea. Let's talk about this
Yeah.
and figure where this is. Nobody took any steps. And you were talking about at the ends of the earth. This place is literally, like you can imagine, Star Wars being filmed out here. It is in the middle of friggin' nowhere. And it's
Nowhere.
It's one of the more inhospitable places on Earth. And if you look at pictures, of which there are a handful that are relatively clear, it's these rolling sand dunes. I mean, it really,
Yeah,
honest to God, it reminds me of something from Star Wars, but it's like these rolling sand dunes that, the sand was very fine, but it was a hard packed ground underneath the sand, which of course leads it to wide open tank country
yeah.
with
And
virtually no cover at all either.
there is, there's a lot of grass here.
Hmm.
There are some small eucalyptus trees occasionally here and there, but yeah, for the most part, the terrain leading up to this river on both sides is pancake flat in a lot of areas, and then it goes down into bluffs nearer to this river. So there are some terrain features here, but as the Japanese say, when you hear the word heights, you imagine a mountain or at least a hill. But here it meant something more like a raised pancake with a diameter of about 2 miles. So yeah, straight from the horse's mouth there.
I like that. Yeah, a
Yeah,
raised pancake. Sounds like my wife's pancakes, and we call them collision mats at the house. They're delicious. They're huge, but they're fantastic. But
right.
anyway, multiple border clashes. So we're gonna talk about three specific border clashes. One, of course, being the Battle for Nomonhan, which is the biggest one. But
Yeah,
there were multiple border clashes between Manchukuo and Outer Mongolia from now until 1939, actually before that, even 1937, 38, all
yeah,
the way until 1945. The Japanese claim that there were at least 1,600 border clashes between these two forces. The Soviets claimed about 1,800 border clash and define border clash, you say.
right.
From what I was able to decipher, it could literally mean shouting matches between two opposing forces, fist fights, gunfights, artillery barrages, you name it. If people get
Yeah.
angry at one another and start yelling at one another, it's essentially classified as a border clash between these two forces. So it's not surprising that, especially in 1937, 1938, and later 1939, when you've got, the Kwangtung Army, who's just this,
Fire
force,
breathing. Yeah.
things
Out
are
of
going to go
control.
down
Yeah.
big time. And this is probably, I would venture to say this is one of, and we'll get to this later, one of the more out of control aspects of the Kwangtung Army's history. Honest to God, it
Yeah.
really is, because of the sheer amount of men that they throw in here.
Right.
So one of the first large scale clashes occurs in 1937 along a little river called the Amur River. Um, it's as I put in the notes, it's a rather small and insignificant clash, but it is one of the first large scale, if you will. The Japanese called it the Kenchazu incident, and it's a short, quick fight in June of 1937. Two Soviet river gunboats come up the Amur River and basically dump people off on this little island in the middle of the Amur River. Now, the Japanese claim that that's their territory, and the Soviets claim that that's their territory. And as one can imagine, things go south after that. Um, the Soviets don't drop off a ton of dudes out there. It's about 40 guys that they drop off
Yeah.
out there. And the following day, Manchukuo police force goes across the river, and one would imagine in some boats, I guess, and goes over there to see these people and say essentially, "Hey, get the heck off my island."
GTFO. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, and they find that these Soviets are now digging in. They're not planning to leave
Right.
anytime soon. So when they go to get them out of there, they wind up getting chased off themselves, and this just starts a snowball effect here relatively quickly, and things go from bad to worse here, don't they?
Yeah. Absolutely. So at that point, the Japanese send out troops from their first division, which is obviously a very old and well trained Japanese division, and they prepare to execute an assault on that island. There is a quick little artillery barrage. I wouldn't even term it that, but the Japanese are using some of their 37 millimeter anti tank guns to take pot shots at the Soviets. They sink one of those gunboats, and the Soviets, for their part, respond with relatively weak gunfire, thereby giving the Japanese the impression that either they've gone or they're not, that the Soviets are not really prepared to fight them.
Yeah. As the gunboat plops down in the water. The Japanese open fire on the crew because the crew is trying to get to the island because the gunboat was moored relatively close to the island.
Right.
It gets sunk. The crew gets off of that thing and starts to swim towards the island. The Japanese then take them under fire. Then the Soviets decide, well, hell, let's get to our side of the river. They try to swim across this river. And as they do so, they're taken under fire by the 37 millimeters and more importantly, Japanese automatic weapons. And the Japanese start killing a lot of these guys. And I
Yeah, they
believe
killed
it's,
most of them. 37
yeah,
and yeah,
37. Yeah, yeah.
right.
So the Japanese eventually go back across this river in the middle of the river, if you will, and reoccupy the island. And the Soviets are very contrite at this point in
Hmm.
1937. They basically tell the Japanese or the Manchukuo police force, if you will, hey, our bad. We're not going to do that again. Let's just, everybody be cool. We're not going to do that. Sorry, our mistake. You killed 37 of our people. Oh, and by the way, the Japanese don't take any casualties, by the way.
Right,
Um, and it leads the Japanese to believe that, this is in the midst of the Stalinist purges. And this
right.
leads the Japanese to several different beliefs, not the least of which is that because of these purges, the Soviet military is weak, they don't want to fight, and it leads to other things. But talk about the purges, John. The purges, this
Yeah,
is significant.
yeah, it is. And this certainly has a massive impact on, what's going to happen on the Eastern Front during
Yes.
1941 from there on. And even in earlier events like the Winter War against Finland, you see the same thing. Basically, um, in 1937, under the police chief Yezhov, the head of the NKVD, and Yagoda as well. There are these, very creepy kind of dudes that are working under Stalin, and Stalin is trying to consolidate political power. And he's also just a massively paranoid guy to begin with. And so the Great Terror engulfs both Soviet civilian society and also their military. And in the course of those purges, the numbers are nebulous, but it looks like, between 1.2 and 2 million Soviet citizens are going to end up being killed in that. The army gets turned upside down. And even though in aggregate, only about three 3 to 8% of the Soviet officer corps, which had grown enormously during its military expansion in the 30s, that these purges end up removing from power about, let's call it 7% of the officer corps.
Mhm.
And most of these guys are not necessarily going to be lined up against the wall and shot. Most of them are just, removed from the party and taken out of command. But the effects are disproportionately at the upper end of the food chain. So three of the five Soviet marshals, including Tukhachevsky, who's the guy who is responsible for Soviet doctrine called deep battle, which is going to be resurrected in 1942, but he is now politically disgraced and he is shot and killed. And, so three of the five are killed in the marshals ranks, and then 13 of 15 army commanders, 8 of their 9 admirals, 50 of their 57 army corps commanders, 154 out of 186 division commanders as well. So
God.
you can see that all of your top end commanders are basically gone. Some of these
Mm.
cats are going to be resurrected or rehabilitated. Guys like Rokossovsky, who's one of their finest armor commanders, he's eventually going to, get back into the Red Army when Barbarossa goes down in 1941. But the effects on this are on the army are that basically you've got a lot of guys in divisional command who just don't know what they're doing because a lot of these junior officers are now being promoted over their heads to fill this vacuum at the top of the Red Army. And the result is that uh, they're people that just are over their heads. They don't know what they're
Hmm.
doing. They don't,
Inexperience. Yeah.
yeah, inexperienced. And they very much do not want to be on anybody's radar at the political level because anybody who looks like they might be a potential threat to Stalin,
Yeah.
that's not what you want. So the Japanese are looking at all this. They don't really know the full extent of that, but it's clear that there's a lot of turmoil happening within the Soviet Union from the middle of 1937 on. And that is going to inform Japanese opinions as we get into 1939 and start talking about this battle at Nomonhan.
Yeah. So, and one can see that, I mean, if you got a force that occupies an island, and then they get the worst end of the
by
fight,
far.
and then they're sitting there going, "Oh, our bad, our sorry, sorry about that, sorry about that."
Yeah,
You can definitely see how that could influence someone's opinion for sure.
yeah.
So again, this happens in 1938 at a place in August, specifically at a little place called Lake Khasan. Rich Frank says the telling feature of this specific clash was that the local Japanese officer in charge, which was a General Suitako Kamizo, no surprise here, completely disregards
Yep,
Tokyo and the emperor to
yep,
not escalate the situation above a shouting match, essentially. Completely disregards the orders coming from on high and decides he's going to do his own thing. This is a consistent, and
yep.
we make
Happens
light of it,
over and
but
over.
yeah,
Yeah,
we make light of it, but it's asinine because you could never feel like something like this is going to go down in the British Army or the American
right.
Army or even Soviet Army for sure. Yet it's a consistent thing that happens in the IJA, specifically the Kwangtung Army, all the
Yep.
time here. And this is just par for the
Gekko
course,
Kujo. Yep, leadership from below, which yeah, other armies refer to as sparkling insubordination,
or treason.
and yeah, and practitioners of that particular art form are typically lined up against walls, but not in the Japanese army. So yeah, here at this other clash in 38, we got this unoccupied piece of high ground that Suitaka insists is Japanese territory, even though it's not.
Right.
Um, so, but yeah, I mean, sort of might makes right is kind of the Japanese position at this point. So he understands from decoded Soviet messages that the Soviets were going to occupy some heights near this Lake
Right.
Khasan. He was not going to stand for that. And even though the Soviets had built some fortifications and dug in, uh, the Japanese end up clashing around these heights. And in the course of that, the Japanese are going to pull out of their kit bag their patented night attack uh, credentials. This is what they do. This is sort of one of the foundation stones of their entire infantry doctrine because they have a respect for Soviet firepower. And so their entire doctrine is built around maneuver and night attack so that you can negate those superiorities in firepower
Yeah, and you're going to see that at Nomonhan, at least in the beginning too
over and
here.
over and over. Yep.
So the Soviets respond to this attack with airstrikes. They bring in airstrikes over the next several days and bring in more infantry. They eventually gain the upper hand. They outflank the Japanese, but the Japanese still hold the field of battle. So in other words, they have them not completely encircled, but they have them almost encircled, and the Japanese are not giving up
Yeah.
this little hilly area right here. They're holding on to it tighter than a tick. And at one point, the Japanese realize, okay, we're taking a lot of casualties, and we're in a bad situation here. So let's call a ceasefire to this. They request a ceasefire. They actually do get this ceasefire. Um, but this is unlike the previous incident at the Airmore River, in which there's only 30, well, I say only, but there's 37 guys killed.
Yeah.
This is not like that. This is a significant amount of human beings that are engaged here. There's over 526 Japanese lose their lives, and a further 913 are wounded. More
Yeah.
than 700 Soviets are killed, and a further 3,200 are wounded.
Yeah.
I mean, this is not an insignificant fight here. This is a fight. This is an actual battle.
Yeah, brigade sized action or larger divisional. And yeah, one of the things though that the Japanese take away from this again is that our night tactics are good, and two, and this is something that Ed Dre talks about in his study of Nomonhan that he prepared when he was, I think, still in the army in the 1980s, was that the Japanese, when it came to close combat, up close and personal with bayonets and that sort of thing, the Soviets were not as good at it as the Japanese were. The Japanese liked going toe to toe with people, and they ended up rating their troops as being the equal of five Soviets when it came to close combat and that sort of thing. So that's all well and good, but those are not necessarily healthy lessons to be taking along with you to a larger clash that's going to involve a lot of artillery and that sort of thing. So
A lot of artillery and armor,
foreshadowing. Yeah,
but yeah,
exactly.
really. But you know, I mean, they bring that belief with them all the way through the war. You know that
Yes, they do.
they're morally the Japanese do that they're morally superior, that they're
To anybody.
oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, to anybody, yeah, but they're also their you know their spirit. That's what I was
Yep.
looking for. Their spirit is going to carry them through. Their spirit is going to overwhelm, you know, 37
Can
millimeter anti-tank gun shooting canister and all this other
yeah.
stuff. And it's just and it's their death knell, honestly, and
Yeah.
a lot, especially in places like Guadalcanal.
Yeah.
So as the foreshadowing continues, on the 4th of May, 1939, a band of Mongolian horsemen wander onto a patch of ground that the Japanese find out is technically their patch of ground. Now, the Mongolians are there to find forage for their horses. They're
Yeah.
there to feed and water their animals. Um, Story is that they stumbled into this part of the land. Other historians say that they were intentionally going into that land. I find that difficult to believe, frankly, but I don't know. Regardless of this, once these Mongolians are there, the Japanese, of course, immediately respond with an infantry attack, and they drive these horsemen back across the Khalkhin Gol near Nomonhan, and force these guys back. The next day, the Mongolians are back. So,
Hmm.
more than likely, this is an ordered operation. They
Sure.
send more horsemen back over there across here, and now the Japanese attack again and don't remove the Mongolian horsemen from this particular piece of territory. There is a gentleman named Lieutenant Colonel Azuma
Yaozo. Yeah.
Yaozo, who is a CO of the recon element of the 23rd Division in this
Yep.
area. He now decides that he's going to have to, well, he doesn't decide, he's ordered actually to respond to this attack, cobble his forces together, get in there with your men with larger force, and get these people the hell out of here.
Right.
He does that very thing. He goes in there, forces the Mongolians out, and then decides to occupy that territory. And once he occupies that territory, the Soviets find out about this and they respond in kind, don't they?
Correct. Yeah. So at this point, now the Soviets start bringing, I don't want to say mainline forces in, because the majority of their forces in this area are territorial divisions that are not necessarily all that well trained and equipped, but nevertheless they have a lot of people, and so they bring over a larger group that now starts bringing in actually some artillery to bear, and they surround Azuma's contingent of about 220 guys and basically wipe them out. So they kill 97, they wound another 13, and at that point, the Kwangtung Army decides to ignore the fact that they have been soundly defeated,
Yeah,
and and continue their actions. But the Russians are now moving significant forces into this area. So it's now kind of okay. Are you going to up the ante and continue going here, or are you going to back down? And of course, knowing the Japanese, we know what the answer to that is going to be.
especially the Kwangtung Army. So
Yep.
they decide to, Lieutenant General Komatsubara Mishitaro is
Yep.
the commanding officer, commanding general of the 23rd Division. Now, the
Yes.
23rd Division is a relatively new unit. Uh,
Brand new.
they're about
6
6-ish months
months.
old, if you will.
Yep.
And just go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, another thing that's sort of happening behind the scenes here is that the Japanese army is going through a reorganization, and they are switching their forces over from what we would call square divisions to triangular divisions. So in the old school divisions, they were organized as two brigades that had two infantry regiments apiece. So you've got, a square unit of four regiments, if you will. But they've decided that in order to have more divisions and be able to maneuver more separate formations, they're going to switch over to this triangular formation, which is kind of the classic way that you see divisions formed in World War II, or they're all pretty much triangular, regardless of country, except for the Italians. Um, so what ends up happening then is you've got these four regiments in the old style divisions. We're going to pare those down to three, And that means that there's going to be a regiment that's often the odd man out. And so that old regiment will then be taken and paired up with two new regiments to form one of these newer triangular divisions. And that's absolutely what's happening here. So you have an old regiment. The 28th Infantry Regiment is going to be paired up with the new 71st and 72nd Regiments to form this new division called the 23rd. But since they are very newly formed, their equipment kind of isn't up to snuff. And
Right.
so there are only 65 total artillery pieces in the TO of this particular division, and that includes their anti-tank artillery, which is 17 37 millimeter AT pieces. So this is a very firepower light division, I guess I would say. The other thing that ends up happening, though, is that in conjunction with the 23rd that they're going to send into this Nomonhan area, they end up forming what you can basically think of as a mechanized brigade. So they've got a group called the Yasuoka Detachment, which is a couple of infantry battalions, but that they beef up with two
Tanks.
separate tank regiments, the 3rd and 4th, and turn it into this composite brigade. And that is going to be sort of covering the southern flank of the 23rd Division when they come into this area.
So they're piling a lot of people in here. So
Yeah,
the no surprise, the Kwangtung Army responds to threat with as you were saying, more force, and they're bringing in. At this point, they're going to have 112 anti-tank guns, 24 AAA guns, over 180 aircraft are going to be backing them up of various kinds, and
yeah,
13 additional infantry battalions. So this is no
yeah,
longer a clash. This is threatening to become a full-scale war.
yeah. This
This is
is
a lot
divisional
of
plus.
people.
Yeah,
Right. So on June the 27th, 1939, the Kwangtung Army launched the offensive against the Soviets by conducting an airstrike that, again, no surprise, had not been cleared by IGHQ in Tokyo. They launched this airstrike to hit Soviet forces behind the lines, which is what airstrikes generally do, and no one in Tokyo knew what the hell was going on. They wound up calling uh, Komatsubara to the mast, really, because they chew him
yeah,
out over this. But it doesn't matter. He's already conducted the operation. The Japanese are already moving on their own. The Kwangtung Army is doing its own thing yet again.
yeah. I mean, and just again, think about this in sort of modern terms. Can you imagine, uh, yeah, the British Army or the American Army or any sort of army kicking off on its own recognizance, a multi-brigade attack on an enemy without clearing that with the national authorities? It's absolutely ludicrous. So yeah, the Kwangtung Army was a real thing. So in any case, um, the Japanese in the short term are actually victorious in terms of this air war. They end up really putting a haymaker on the
They do.
Soviets in this neck of the woods, to the point that the local Soviet air commander loses his life as a result of his failure to predict or prevent this sort of preemptive strike.
So aside from that, it also just pisses the Soviets off even more. And there's a guy we're going to talk about here in a minute. But getting back to the Kwangtung Army, one of the guys that's a planner for this preemptive strike and for this, for all intents and purposes, invasion
Yeah,
is a guy that, I know you love to hate because this guy is a jerk, man. I mean, this dude's all over the Pacific War.
yeah.
We're talking, of course, about Suji Masanobu. Can you eh,
Yeah.
enlighten us on this guy one more time? Because he is just a
He's just a horrible, horrible human being. Suji is an arch nationalist. He is on the far right fringes here in the Kwangtung Army. He is an extremely intelligent, slippery, amoral dude. He's also a very gifted operational planner. And the reason I know this guy is because he is going to be the chief of staff of Yamashita's 25th Army in the Malayan campaign. He's going to show up in Bataan right before the death march there, and he's arguably responsible for some elements of that as well. He's also responsible for the Sukching massacres in Singapore after that campaign. He's going to end up in Guadalcanal. he's going to end up basically kicking off the entire Kokoda campaign in New Guinea on his own dime as well. I mean, this dude is everywhere. He ends up in Burma. He ends up dining on the liver of a downed Allied airman in
Mm.
1944. Um, and but the kind of the crazy thing is, even within the Japanese army, I mean, a lot of people just hate this guy. One Japanese general refers to him as a poisonous insect, and he just, because he's got this grating, insolent behavior. He's awful to be around, and he just can't help but calling people stupid, including his superiors. One other notorious incident about this guy, he um he abandoned his own wife and children in Japan so that he can, be focusing on his duties in China, and ends up burning down a geisha house in China that had Japanese officers in it at the time, because he wanted, to wipe out the moral corruption that was going on in this geisha house. So as you can understand, he ends up getting himself kicked out of command after command after command, but he's in good with a certain guy named Hideki Tojo, and he's sort of on the winning side of the factional politics that are going on within the Japanese army at this time. And so the end result is, as I described, he's going to be in prominent positions throughout the Japanese army as an operational planner throughout the Asia Pacific War. And he's here in Nomonhan.
What happens to him though? He survives, does he not?
Well, okay, so that's the thing that really bakes my beans. He he hides out while Scap is, in Japan.
Yeah.
And as soon as we leave Japan, he comes back to Japan and he's elected to the Diet twice. I mean, this is a guy with, sort of the moral compass of one of your average Einsatzgruppen members. And the
Yeah.
fact that he's elected to the Diet just makes me ill. Um, and yet at the same time, he's also working with U.S. intelligence. In
Mm.
fact, I have some documents that I was reading just the other day. That these, when he finally goes missing, this happens, I think, in 1961. He decides to go over, make a trip into Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia to kind of see what's going on in the wars over there, and he disappears. And
Mm.
nobody to this day knows what happened to him. I think the most convincing scenario is that he may have been kidnapped by the Chinese intelligence services and killed in China, or he may have also fallen into the hands of the Pathet Lao in Laos. But either way, I mean, he just ends up disappearing off the face of the earth. And
Mm.
I hope that whatever did happen to him was incredibly painful and protracted, because
I
he's
was going to
just,
say good riddance.
yeah, good riddance, because he's just vile. Anyway, he's the guy now who's working with 23rd Division to basically kick off this offensive that is way above their pay grade. But it's pretty clear, too, that not only does 23rd Division have orders from 6th Army that is overseeing them, but I would argue that 6th Army is getting orders from Kwangtung headquarters that, like, yeah, just go ahead and do this thing, and we'll make it work out with Tokyo.
Well, they are now, because
Yep,
after the airstrike, after the air raid into Mongolian territory, where you know IGHQ blows a gasket and
yep,
calls it CO to the mast. After they read this guy the riot act, they say, all right, fine. You know what? Do your thing, and I quote, expel the invaders is what they
right,
tell. So the Japanese IGHQ at this point is definitely behind this operation
for
to
sure.
this degree, or to this stage rather. So the Japanese are going to basically do the classic maneuver of a double envelopment. That's what they're
Yep,
going to do. It's going to be a two-pronged assault. The far western prong of the attack is going to be the main force, which is the 23rd Division that we just talked about, with three regiments, with half of a fourth, and also would have armored support. Now, the
yep,
Japanese armored support is varying in terms of quality and degree, but it's armor. It is
yep.
armor. So
Let
some
me
armor is
let me
better than
actually.
none.
Oh, I'm sorry. I
No,
was just
I'm sorry.
gonna pop up a quick little map here for our audience to just kind of show this double envelopment that we're trying to get going here. If I can find that map, but yeah. So what you can see here on the left-hand flank, you've got Task Force Kobayashi, who is actually going to move into territory that the Japanese don't even claim for themselves. So they are going to go over to the western side of the Khalkhin River and try to move down its bank, while this mechanized brigade, the Yasuoka Task Force, is going to move down and form the left flank of this operation to clear those Mongolian troops out of the east bank of the river and force them back across the river onto the western side.
So the initial Japanese attacks begin on the 1st of July. It's actually goes off pretty well initially. They attack and take the Fui Heights, which are
Mm-hmm.
east of the river.
Yep.
The following, and there, this is basically just to get what little, we're talking about the big thick pancake here. It's what little heights that they have around here. We're going to grab those heights so we can see what the hell's going on when we launch our main assault, which is going
Yep.
to happen the following night. The Japanese are going to launch well, it's kind of early morning. It's, dawnish type, dawnish time rather when they launch this assault. It's going to be commenced by the 23rd Division crossing the river and, as I put in the notes, thus entering Mongolian territory. So this is no longer we're expelling you from expel the invaders. No, we are now the invaders.
Yeah.
Um, the Japanese are also, as we mentioned earlier, they're fully aware that the Soviets have a lot of artillery. And one of the reasons that they're moving in under the cover of darkness is to hopefully avoid that artillery as they're moving in and launching their assault. So they go on the night of July the 2nd, July the 3rd, which happens to be a moonless night. They build a pontoon bridge to get equipment across this river, but the pontoon bridge is actually not big enough to support a lot of the armor that they want to get over there at this stage. So things kind of start to go sideways right here. That being said, they do get some armor, they do get some people across this bridge, and they start and they launch their attack, and things kind of snowball for the Soviets initially, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. They had not expected this assault to come across the river onto their side of the border because
Right.
this is supposed
You
to be
know,
a border fracas. Um, and so, with basically a reinforced division moving down the west side of the river undetected, they pile into these initial Soviet forces and basically eject them. The same thing is happening over on the east side of the river, where Yasuoka's tanks attack in the early morning of the 3rd, and also covered by a thunderstorm as well. And so the result of that is that the Soviet 149th Infantry Regiment just basically breaks and runs. This brings in um, a
one of the
new
baddest dudes of the war, let's be real.
new dramatis personae
Yeah.
in the form of Georgy Zhukov, who is going to go on to be really kind of the number two guy in the Soviet military underneath Stalin during all of the Great Patriotic War. So, as I described, we've got this power vacuum at the top of the Red Army at this point because of the purges. And the result is that there are a lot of pretty junior cats that are now kind of, moving up the ranks. At this point in time, Zhukov is kind of a nobody. He is the deputy head of the cavalry in the Belarusian military district. But as a result of these fracases, he gets sent out by Moscow to take over the first Soviet Mongolian People's Army, and he's going to be the cat in charge of this operation. Zhukov is the son of a very poor peasant family just outside of Moscow. He ends up in the Red Army during the revolutionary period, and he's going to rise through the ranks relatively quickly. He is, what do I want to say? He's a pretty brutal individual, at least in terms of his callousness towards Soviet casualties. This is a guy who is not afraid to lay down the blood if it can achieve the military goals that have been set out for him. He is one of the few cats who has the the spine and the intellect to be able to stand up to Stalin and actually make Stalin listen. And that is one of sort of the ongoing kind of fascinating stories in this 42 book that I've been working on, is just looking at the evolution of their relationship It's still not at that point, obviously. At this point, he's a relatively junior commander who's being sent out to run what is, in essence, going to be a Soviet corps. But this is kind of Zhukov's lucky break. This battle is going to end up being the vehicle that is going to catapult this guy to stardom within the Red Army. Within 2 years of the conclusion of this battle, uh, Zhukov is going to be the head of the Red Army's general staff. So talk about a meteoric rise, and it begins right here.
Yeah, and you're going to see some of the tactics. I said he's one of the baddest dudes of the war because, it's claimed that he never lost a battle, and it kind of
No, that's
it.
baloney.
Well, it is because he loses this first part of it right here, but he takes the Germans to task all the way across the Eastern Front, and I mean he is just a blunt force from the minute he gets
Yeah,
on the field until the end of the war, and it actually starts with his counteroffensive that we're going to talk about here in just a few
yeah,
minutes because he, as you said, he believes in bringing meat to the grinder, and not
yep,
only meat to the grinder, but tanks and artillery. And
yep,
oh boy, does he. So
yeah.
at this stage, as the Japanese are launching their attack across the river, he's relatively unaware that there's really anything going on at all on
On the
his
west bank.
side. Yeah,
Yeah,
on his side of the river. Once he gets wind of, hey, the Japanese are in our territory on this side of the river, he immediately rolls in his 11th Tank Brigade and their related units north towards a hill called Bain Sagan, which is located on their side of the river, mind you.
yeah,
On the early morning hours of the 3rd of July, the Japanese start popping these Soviet tanks with their 37 millimeter guns and just like taking these guys out left and right. These are
yeah,
not the Soviet tanks that you're going to see rolling through the steppe in
yeah,
1942, 43, 44, and 45. These are relatively, I'd say, lightly armored tanks, BT
yeah,
7s, early Soviet tanks like this. And they're also
yep,
gasoline powered. And we can get to that in a second, too.
yep. Yeah, no, I wanted to talk about that too because yes, there are no T-34s on this
No,
battlefield. The
no.
majority of the Soviet armor here is either BT-5 or BT-7 tanks. These
Mhm.
are relatively light, 11 to 13 ton vehicles armed with a 45 millimeter gun. They got, 11, 15, maybe 17 millimeters worth of armor on them. But they're relatively innovative vehicles in that they've got the classic Christie suspension, which is going to go on to be mounted on the T-34. They use sloped armor on their front glacis plate to increase the
Mhm.
relative protection of that relatively thin plate by sloping it. They're highly mobile vehicles. They've got a pretty decent 45 millimeter gun. So they're relatively useful and fast, but the problem is that a lot of them have defective welds, meaning that there are often gaps between the armor, particularly around the engine compartment, and they are powered by a gasoline engine, which
Yep.
turns out to be highly inflammable. And so the standard Japanese anti-tank tactics against this vehicle are to get up close and use a Molotov cocktail and chuck it onto the engine deck and just set the engine of this tank on fire. And it's pretty clear from the accounts that you read that they were pretty successful in doing that, which likewise calls into question just how good Soviet infantry tactics were in, uh, brushing back any sort of Japanese infantry that would be making these assaults. That says to me that that these Soviet tanks were not operating in close cooperation with their
They were not.
infantry. Yeah, they weren't.
They were not.
So
Yeah.
yeah, the result is
Yeah.
a lot of dead Soviet tankers. They also had a lot of armored cars in this battle, really lightly armored cars as well. And we see in some of the photographs of it there, those armored cars are all over the place as well.
Yeah, and Zhukov, exactly to your point, he kind of knee jerks and he just boom, and he sends his vehicles, his armored vehicles in there, tanks. I'm talking about the fives and the sevens, and without infantry support, or at least without a large infantry presence. And as we all know,
Yeah.
armored vehicles, tanks, no matter what it is, I don't care if it's a King Tiger or a BT-5
Yep.
against infantry, bad things are going to happen. And that's
Yeah.
exactly what happens here. To your point, the Japanese are dropping Molotov cocktails on there. Everything's going kaboom. The Russians take a significant beating here. So Soviet, or not Soviet, I'm sorry, Zhukov, actually, the whole myth of him not losing a battle, well, he does right here because he
Yeah.
gets taken to task by the Japanese in this initial assault, or rather counter assault. More than 450 tanks are massed by Zhukov, and armored cars in the area against the Japanese after they conduct this initial assault that is basically just destroyed. So Zhukov
Yeah,
starts piling people and material in here because he wants to get the Japanese the hell off of that territory.
yeah.
So go ahead. You're going to say something?
No, basically what ends up happening is that the Japanese kind of conquer themselves into a dead end, is what it comes down
Exactly.
to.
And
Yeah,
they're essentially cut off. Well, they're not
right,
cut off per se, but they're like a thumb sticking in your eye. They're in
right.
the middle of nowhere and they really don't have a lot of logistic support. Number one, number two, they are like a peninsula and they're surrounded on three sides at least by Soviets, and the Soviets are mounting forces, massing forces in the area to push the Japanese out of here.
And
So
you've only got one rickety pontoon bridge back over
yes.
across this river, which means that your own logistical support is none too good. So, yeah,
No,
not
and we already know that the pontoon bridge is a pile because they couldn't get all the people that they wanted to get over there and all the vehicles they wanted over there. So now
yep.
they're really stuck out on a limb. So the Japanese now realize that they have to have additional bridge building material on hand. They have to reinforce this position or they're going to get wiped out. So on the night of the 4th of July, the Japanese start reestablishing themselves on the Fui Heights.
Which means
The
they're
J-
withdrawing, is what it comes down to.
exactly. That's
Yeah,
exactly
we're
what they're
pulling
doing.
out of this untenable salient into Soviet territory and moving back across the river and putting ourselves on the Fui Heights. And we can show that on the map as well. It's basically up at the north where the river takes its little jog over to the west there. That's pretty much where the Fui Heights are on the eastern side of the river.
So once the Japanese get across the river, they blow this old raggedy pontoon bridge,
Yeah,
which to me says the Japanese are like, okay, we got over here, we're done, we're out. Let's,
yeah.
our bad, my mistake.
Right.
But
Because
that is
at this
not
point, they've cleared most of the Soviet troops off of the eastern
right,
bank at this point.
right. But the Kwangtung Army being the Kwangtung Army, that's not what happens. Over the next several weeks, they start pot shotting at one another with various small caliber artillery shells, taking rifle shots at one another. They're essentially rather just kind of poking each other, just poking at one
Right.
another from across the river. The Kwangtung army most certainly had been humiliated by the assault, and then they're having to retreat back across the river. Um, they were confident that if they're going to get back into the territory, that they're going to sweep the field of the Soviets. So confident are they that they actually bring journalists and photographers with them to document their next assault. Um, as we're going to see, not much of these pictures and
Yeah.
text makes it to see the light of day.
Yeah.
So
The other
the
thing that ends
Japanese
up
also,
happening
yeah,
is
good.
just they also after the Yasuoka detachments first initial advances were pretty successful, but they end up losing about 50% of their vehicle park. And as a result of that, the Japanese make the decision to pull the third and fourth tank regiments out of their order of battle and send them back for refitting, which means now the 23rd Division is sitting on the other side of this river, or on the Japanese claimed eastern bank of
Disputed
this
border.
river,
Yeah.
but having to face up to what is likely to be an additional heavy Soviet attack, and they don't have any armor support at this point.
And they don't have any intelligence either. They don't,
Yeah,
and by that I'm talking military intelligence. They do not realize the amount of forces that Zhukov is building
right.
on his side of the river. And we're not talking a couple hundred dudes. We're talking thousands of people.
Yeah,
Excuse me, because Moscow is now paying attention to this, and Moscow issues orders to send more people to Zhukov, more tanks, more artillery, and
yeah,
artillery by the truckload. So the Soviets are responding to this as this is no longer a border clash. This is potentially a war. We're going to bring the house over there, at least as much as
right.
we can, to outer Mongolia, and that's exactly what they do.
And
Um,
that's the problem, though, is how do you bring the house to a place that is this remote?
it's in the
And
middle of
so,
nowhere. Yeah.
yeah, let me share that uh, image at this point too. So if you take a look at a map of the Soviet Mongolian border, what you see here is that you've got this Hulun Lake, which carves this big divot out of the border section, meaning that if the Russians are going to get materiel down to the Khalkhin River. They've got to run it from their railhead at this town called Borgia, which is well north. And they've got to basically do three sides of the trapezoid to bring this stuff down. So this drive, there is no railroad, understand. This drive is every bit of 400 miles long. And the Japanese know this. And so the Japanese are convinced that there's no way that the Soviets will be able to keep any more than one, maybe two divisions down here on the line. But what ends up happening is the Russians commit more than 9,200 trucks to this effort to beef up the 2,000 that Zhukov already has in this neck of the woods. They commit another more than 7,000 trucks to this thing. And they end up building this road train that goes from Borgia down through Choibalsan and then all the way out to Khalkhin. It takes 5 days to make this trip, round trip. But they muster the logistical effort to do that. And the result is that they end up putting, for this climactic August attack that they're going to put in the works, they bring 57,000 people down to this neck of the woods, along with substantial quantities of armor and artillery.
The artillery is there. They're loading artillery in there even before the
Yep.
counteroffensive, because there's a period in July when the Japanese, who also bring artillery into the party
Yeah.
too, by the way.
Yeah.
And it should be noted that at this time, when the Japanese bring in their artillery for the 23rd Division and the surrounding units, that at this stage, this is one of the largest deployments of Japanese artillery in
Yep.
the war. They
Yep.
bring what they think is a tremendous amount of artillery to the area to, let's just say it, chastise the Soviets as they're going to
Yep.
chastise the Chinese. And they start dropping artillery fire on the Soviets. Well, the Soviets have more artillery. They have longer ranged artillery. And the
Nobody does
Japanese are
artillery like the Red Army.
no, and the Japanese can't touch it. And what
Yeah.
little effect the Japanese artillery does have, the Soviets respond, you know, tenfold. So
Yeah.
much so that the Japanese fire over 25,000 rounds, it's estimated.
Yeah.
25,000 rounds of artillery fire. And there was a quote from from a surviving Japanese officer that said that for every round we fired, the Soviets fired three.
Yeah. And that's roughly the ratio of gun tubes as well. So yeah, this is a an all out effort on the part of the Japanese to bring what they think is going to be decisive heavy firepower into this region, and it amounts to a grand total of 1,650 millimeter howitzers. Excuse me, 16 and 16 more 100 millimeter howitzers. By American and Soviet standards, that's laughable. I mean, again, fast forward to the assault from Saipan over to Tinian, where we put 234 heavy barrels just on the golf course, what is now the golf course in Saipan. Okay, so the Japanese are bringing 32 big guns, and they think that that's this is a knockout blow. And no, the Soviets on their side of the river has got more than 3 times that many heavy gun barrels, and they do not lack for ammunition. Um, and this is a pattern that you're going to see repeated over and over in the Red Army's way of making war is with massive artillery preparation. And Zhukov, he's drunk that Kool-Aid and he demonstrates it
Mhm.
here.
Yeah,
So
he's going to demonstrate it for the rest of the war.
yeah,
Anything Zhukov touches has a lot of artillery and a lot of tanks.
that's just how
So
they roll. Yeah,
while the Kwangtung Army is planning their next move, which, by the way, they get slapped again by IGHQ and essentially told to knock it off and let's just de-escalate the situation
yeah,
and maintain the border as it is. To no one's surprise, yet again, they disobey orders and they plan their next move because they have to, quote, save face. They know
right,
they've been defeated the first time. They know they went across and they got pushed back. They know they have to do something, or at least they feel like they have to do something.
right.
But
And
what
and by this point in time, the Kwangtung Army now has suffered from May to July. They have already suffered 5,000 casualties in this fighting. And yes, you're nominally in control of the west or the east bank of this river, and so you've established your territorial claims, but it's demonstrable you haven't been able to eject the Soviets when you tried to go over to the attack. Do you really want to double down on this now? But nevertheless, they do.
Yeah, they do. And we talked about earlier the Japanese did not have a lot of intelligence in terms of what the Soviets were doing. Well, that's the
Yeah,
complete opposite for the Soviets because Zhukov sends aerial recon over there. They start taking pictures. They do what aerial recon does. And Zhukov is completely aware of where the Japanese positions are. He's
yeah,
completely aware of what they have in the area. And he decides he's going to basically just surround it and obliterate it with
yeah.
massed artillery and massed armored assault.
The Soviets also do a really good job of what they will call Maskirovka, which is, deception operations. So that huge group of trucks that is making this run, a lot of them at the end of it are only running at night, and they're driving in many cases with their headlights either dimmed or completely out, so that aerial reconnaissance is not going to work against them. Likewise, on the portion of the river where the Soviets still control, they build at least one, what they would call underwater bridges. So these
Mhm.
are concrete sections that are laid just below the water's level. So they're not really detectable by aerial reconnaissance. But nevertheless, what I've created now is a ford, if you will, where the river is now 6 inches deep where I'm going to come across, and nobody knows where those crossings are. They, in a couple of cases, launch little feint attacks and then let the Japanese decisively defeat those feint attacks so the Japanese feel more confident than they're absolutely due. But by the end of this buildup operation, as I said, they've got 57,000 men online, between 500 and 550 tanks, 400 and 450 armored cars, 600 aircraft, and 550 artillery pieces, including 156 barrels that are larger than 100 millimeter. So yeah, they have more than 3-to-1 superiority in heavy tubes and a massive superiority in tank power.
And they're facing about 30,000-ish Japanese
That's right.
with very little armor, very little armored cars, and as we've already talked about the artillery. So I mean,
Yeah,
it's going to be a
it's
one-sided smash here.
yeah,
So Zhukov's attack begins with Soviet aircraft bombing Japanese positions just before 6 a.m. on the 20th of August, followed by 3 hours of heavy artillery before the bombers come in yet again. The quote here I like is the shock and vibration of incoming bombs and artillery rounds caused Japanese radio telegraph keys to chatter so uncontrollably that the frontline troops could not communicate with the rear, compounding their confusion and helplessness.
that's a bad feeling.
They're bringing down the thunder, my man.
Yeah,
At 0900, after a 3 hour bombardment, Soviet infantry and armor now begin to move forward. Uh, by 10 o'clock, many of the forward positions had already been overrun by the Soviet infantry. Japanese resistance stiffens by around lunchtime, and combat is raging. This is, again, no small area. It's
yeah,
raging over a 40-mile front. So this is no longer a border skirmish. This is a full-fledged battle. This is an
yeah.
obvious engagement here between two large size armies. The
I,
Soviet,
I was just
go
going to
ahead,
say,
go ahead.
let's pop up a map here too, um, just to show this is a classic um, double envelopment on the part of the Soviets. So they have loaded up both flanks of this advance, but the real haymaker is down in the south, where they have the majority of their tank brigades. And the initial assault, though, goes off pretty swimmingly in the north, so much so that Komatsubara, the divisional commander of the 23rd, believes that actually the Soviet emphasis is on what is his right flank, the Soviet left flank, and so he commits the majority of his reserves to the northern part of the battle sector, not realizing that actually the real haymaker is coming up from the south. And so, yeah, you can see what's going to happen here, and it absolutely does.
Yeah,
The Red Army is going to surround this division and cut them off.
yeah, and they absolutely obliterate them over the next 2 days.
Yeah,
The Soviets do that very thing. They wound up encircling the division, encircling other portions of other units, and essentially just cut them off and crush them underneath their
chop
tank
them up into
treads.
little pockets and just crush each pocket individually.
Mhm. Yeah, not unlike Blitzkrieg tactics, honestly, where they punching through the lines, they're encircling units, and they're just
Yep.
further shrinking that circle with every single mile that they move. So by August the 23rd, the southern thrust had reached Nomonhan, where it could and did block a possible Japanese retreat. So the Japanese now try to counterattack. That's what armies do generally. They're going to do the very same thing here on the 24th of August. The 72nd Regiment launches a counterattack and they run into essentially a Soviet tank park and they just get chopped to pieces. They suffer nearly 50% casualties and they're ordered to withdraw before the end of the day. They get back to the Fui Heights that had sustained more than 3 days of absolute pounding by Soviet artillery. But the Japanese up on these heights are relatively well entrenched and they're relatively well protected. There's about 800 guys
Yeah.
up on these Fui Heights right here. And they are disrupting Zhukov's timetable for his offensive, but it's only a matter of time.
Yeah. Well, and once again, you do, as we're going to discover, obviously, in the Pacific War, when you bring the Japanese army to bay and now you actually have to eject them from prepared positions, that means you got to get up close and personal, and the Japanese love getting up close and personal, and the Soviets
Mhm.
are not that into it. So the Red Army takes very heavy casualties trying to eject these guys from the top here. But again, just given the preponderance of firepower that the Red Army has at its disposal, yeah, the outcome is really not going to be in doubt. The other
Yeah.
thing that's happening as far as the Japanese are concerned, yeah, they're cut off now. They're running out of supplies. They're running out of water in a lot of cases
Mhm.
too, because the
They're in a
Khalkhin
desert.
goal,
That's
yeah,
right.
they're in a desert, and that river is really the only reliable source of water, and even it apparently is fairly salinated a lot of the time, and so the Japanese troops are just undergoing tremendous privations as they're running out of foodstuffs and water and also bullets.
Yeah. And the Soviets by now do by the on the night of the 20 by the 24th of August, they've cut off the Fui Heights. The Japanese have no access to any kind of supplies or anything at all, and they wind up pulling out that night.
Yeah,
They pull out on the night of the 24th, 25th. They get out of the Fui Heights. The Soviets take over their position and count over like 600 Japanese bodies just in that one area alone.
yeah.
So it's pretty much over for here, although Zhukov is not done, is he?
No, he's not. He's not going to be satisfied until this entire Japanese enclave is absolutely wiped out. And so you end up with we still have the combat record for the 26th Infantry Regiment and a lot of personal accounts from the Japanese soldiers as well, and they're just absolutely harrowing. You have a lot of instances of units being cut off where they fight to the last man, and the commanding officer will then kill himself to prevent himself from being captured. You have scenes of Japanese units charging enemy tanks, the enemy or the Japanese officers using swords. I mean, it's really grim stuff. And here, we have the Japanese predilection for never wanting to surrender, and it takes a terrible toll of this army. Although there are a fair number of Japanese prisoners that are taken in the course of this operation. About 1,000 POWs are going to be captured by the Soviets in the course of this thing.
So by the 27th of August, the Japanese send in a relief force to basically effect a withdrawal for the remaining units that are now surrounded by the Soviets. Uh, this is not a small relief force. This is not like 50 guys. 5,000 men
Yeah,
could not break through the Soviet defensive, or I guess you could say offensive line at this point.
offensive.
They can't get through the thing at all, and they get absolutely pounded by Soviet artillery and Soviet airstrikes. And it's the Japanese are reaching a point where there's nothing they can do.
Yeah,
There's nothing they can do. Zhukov's brought in so much material, so many men, and the Soviets have captured everything that they need to. The Japanese cannot break through, and they are really nearing the end of their rope and about ready to call it quits.
yeah. Yeah, the end result of this is the 23rd Division is essentially destroyed as a fighting unit. And at the end of the operation, there's going to be a ceasefire declared on the 16th of September. And and so bear in mind, 16th September, that is 16 days after the German invasion of Poland has just happened, right?
Mm.
And this is one of the reasons that this battle is completely overshadowed, because World War II has just started in Poland at this point. And so as you can imagine, all of the newspaper headlines are focused on what's going on in Poland rather than what's going on out in this little itty bitty village out in eastern Mongolia. So yeah, in any case, I just find that, sort of the synchronicity of those two operations really interesting, but it does happen at the very beginning of what a lot of us would tend to think of as the beginning of World War II, kicking off in Europe.
So to put some numbers to the
Yeah,
sound defeat and the amount of loss of life that's here, according to Rich Frank, the Kwangtung Army loses 17,176 men. Those are casualties.
yeah,
8,629 are killed, a further 9,087 wounded. That's that's significant loss
yeah,
of service personnel. The 23rd Division, which bore the brunt of the fighting, suffered 79% casualties. 4,976 are killed, 5,321 are wounded, and 349 are missing, which
yeah,
one presumes are dead. The
yeah,
Soviets, however, as is their wont, we talked about this earlier. Zhukov just throws meat into the grinder. This is no different here. 25,000 men are casualties on the Soviet side, 9,703 are killed in action, a further 15,952 are wounded.
yep.
But
So they take heavier casualties than the Japanese do in this battle.
but
Welcome
they
to
can do it
offensive
though.
operations, but yeah, they're successful. That's the
Yeah.
thing.
And
So
they can absorb those losses.
yes,
And you're going to see it for the whole war. The Soviets can absorb those losses, whereas the Japanese cannot.
yeah.
So,
I was just going to add too that 23rd Division goes on to just be this incredibly hard luck outfit. So, the shattered remnants are pulled back to Japan. They're going to be rebuilt. And later in the Asia Pacific War, they're going to be recommitted. And where are they going to end up? On Luzon. And they're going to be fighting up there against MacArthur, and they are going to be wiped out yet again, with an incident of mass starvation at the end too, as their supplies run out. So yeah, the 23rd was not a good division to be serving in if you were in the Imperial Army, because they only have two actions during the course of their life, and they get decisively trounced in both of them.
so following the absolute disaster at
Yeah,
Nomonhan, and that's exactly what it is, because the Kwangtung Army gets absolutely pummeled. We already went into the numbers. Uh, Not to be outdone, they submit a very aggressive plan to Tokyo. Now they're actually going through the right channels. They're not just going to launch an offensive on their own. They're actually doing it the way an army should do it.
right.
And we'll get to that reasons why here in just a second. But they submit basically plans for an escalated war against the Soviet Union. But IGHQ is looking at this and they're going, nah, no, we don't want any part of this. We don't want to
Yeah,
do this at all. And the Japanese wind up trying to seek a diplomatic resolution to the problem and get it. They wind up getting this. They wind up signing, for all intents and purposes, a non-aggression pact, if you will,
right.
with the Soviet Union. That's just what we're calling it. That's not the actual term, but that's essentially what it is. And they wind up calling it quits. But this has significant, this Nomonhan has significant effects within the Kwangtung Army. We're going to talk about the effects on the war here in a minute, but
Yeah.
it has significant effects within the Kwangtung Army and Japanese military doctrine.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, what finally happens here is I sort of look at this as the end of the Kwangtung Army's independence from IGHQ, because in
Agreed.
the wake of this disaster, IGHQ is like, okay, and they end up sending they relieve the commander of the Kwantung Army, a guy named Ueda Kenkichi, who was one of the people who's coming up with this aggressive plan to continue upping the ante against the Soviets after you've just gotten shellacked. So yeah, they clean him out, and they end up sending over a guy who we're already familiar with, Umezu Yoshijiro, who is going to end up at the end of this war. He's going to be the army's chief of staff underneath Anami. He's going to be one of the anti-peace faction. But anyway, Umezu gets sent over to take over Kwantung Army, and he immediately just cleans the house. He gets rid of Ueda's chief of staff. He gets rid of a lot of the staff officers. He cans the commanding officer of the Japanese Sixth Army, and of course gets rid of the 23rd Division's general, Komatsubar, who actually survived this battle, which was, of course, considered pretty disgraceful by Japanese standards. He's going to end up dying of cancer in relatively short order. Otherwise, it just seems unfathomable to me that he actually survived without committing suicide. But nevertheless. So the result of that all is going to be that now Umezu is running this army and is in frequent contact with Tokyo. And so there are not going to be any other incidents that are of this nature that are going to be kicked off on Kwangtung Army's own recognizance. That day is pretty much over at this point.
This event now also changes Japanese military doctrine in a drastically different way.
Well, yes and no. Because you have to, the more perceptive observers within the Japanese army clearly recognize that whoa, we cannot take on
Yeah.
the Red Army. But
They don't have the manpower, they don't have the vehicles, and they don't have the time or the ability to create that size force to deal with the
it's
Soviets.
all money. It's money and
Yeah.
oil. They don't have that. I mean, the Japanese army has made a virtue of necessity by recognizing that they can only really be a light infantry force, and therefore their doctrine and tactics have to conform to that sort of reality. That reality just, as you say, got a 20-pound sledgehammer in the face, but they have no ability to make good on that. I still don't have the oil. I still don't have the money. I am never going to be able to create an army that has sufficient mechanization and armor and firepower to be able to go up against the Red Army. It's just not conceivable. But the result of that, and I found this fascinating as I was looking through Ed Dre's study, he says the IJA's basic conclusion was that the greatest lesson from the Nomonhan experience was the magnificent display of traditional spiritual power as the basis for modern warfare.
Mhm.
You had all these episodes of Japanese troops laying down their lives and charging tanks with swords, and wasn't that magnificent, and blah, blah, blah. He goes on, naturally, firepower would have to be increased to complement the spiritual power, but the Japanese continued to rely on intangible factors to win battles. As infantry, they were excellent, but as soldiers fighting a modern war, they were an anachronism, as the Pacific War would ultimately demonstrate. And so, yeah, what I kind of see from the Japanese perspective is that they just retreat further into this sort of Yamato Damashi,
Mhm.
the Yamato spirit, that's going to carry us through. Essentially, their answer is, well, pray harder next time. Just
Yeah.
be more aggressive, and I don't know, but yeah, that these are not necessarily good lessons that the Army doctrine as a whole is now promulgating. Again, there are certainly cooler heads within their army that are like, this does not portend good things against the Soviets. It's going to take them a while, though, to finally come to terms with the fact that, by the way, all those painful lessons we learned at Nomonhan, they're going to apply to these American guys too.
Yeah, tenfold. Yeah,
Yeah.
tenfold. But that whole "we will win with our spirit"
Yes.
thing, and that travels with them through the entirety
Everywhere.
of the war, through the entirety of the war, and it just never results in any kind of major significant victory against a well fortified enemy like the United States.
Yeah.
So
There are
this event,
political.
yeah,
I was
no, go
gonna,
ahead, go ahead, go ahead.
political implications too. So this ends up bringing down the
The government
Hiranuma.
falls.
The government falls. So yeah, if that's not an indication that you didn't do real good, son. Yeah. So the Hiranuma government falls as a result of this. It's going to be replaced by a very short-lived um, administration under a guy named Abe Nobuyuki. He's going to be out after just 4 months, at which point uh, Prime Minister Mitsumasa Yonai. And again, I just love the foreshadowing of this war as a whole. Yonai is going to end up being the Navy minister at the very end of the war, who's going to be in the pro-peace faction anyway. Yonai also served as a prime minister because when you have a government that is run mostly by military guys, you get to be premier. So yeah, he's going to be in control of the Japanese government up until January 1940, and after that comes Konoe and the radical transformation of Japanese diplomacy and the joining of the tripartite pact and all that good stuff. But that's down the road. But yeah, you can see here that the implications from this little tiny village, this little, out in the middle of nowhere, that clash was sufficient to bring major transformation to the Japanese political scene.
And the military scene as well, because there's a gentleman who was the head of the Army General Staff's operations section named Inada Masazumi. He summed up the importance of this event, and I quote, he says, "The Nomonhan incident destroyed our guiding principle of preparing for global conflict by consolidating our position in the North, which would have been achieved by settling the China War and building up our strength against the Soviet Union. Instead, after the Nomonhan incident, Japan unexpectedly drifted towards the decision to move south, the invasion of French Indochina, and
Yeah.
finally the Pacific War. It was this change of policy which I regretted most, I bet you did, after being expelled from the Army General Staff. The Nomonhan incident was a turning point which had a great influence on the history of Japan. Even now, when I look back at it, I think so from the bottom of my heart, unquote.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Game changer.
Yeah,
Yeah.
big time. Yeah, it
Yeah.
really is. And it's one of those events that, like we said, happens at the ends of the earth that people don't really understand the overall implications of what happens here in
Yeah.
these, you know.
Even in 1941, the Kwangtung Army ended up massing troops along the Manchurian border and were in a position where they could have launched another invasion of Manchuria because, of course, fast forward to 41 and they're looking at the Red Army as being on the ropes as a result of Operation Barbarossa. Is this our opportunity to go after the Soviets again for good and all? But at that point, there are voices within the Imperial Army who are like, dudes, did you not learn your lesson the first time? We just,
You
I,
got your plow cleaned.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'm just trying to remember from the movie Aliens, who's the Marine there. I don't know if you've been paying attention with pal, but we just got our asses kicked. Um, so, and there are a number of really interesting counterfactuals that come out with that. Yes, Nomonhan was disastrous for the Japanese, but what would have happened if the Soviets, having already being massively on the ropes in the western part of the Soviet Union, do get hit by a 700,000 man invasion of Manchuria in 1941? Could that have potentially brought down the Soviet Union? I don't know. But I do know that a war in the East was just the last thing in the world that Stalin and the Red Army needed in towards the middle and end of 1941. The other thing that your Japanese officer, though, doesn't mention with regards to the tension between move north and move south is that, what, at the end of the day, yeah, maybe you could have invaded Manchuria, but there's no oil there
Right.
and you've got to go, in the face of an oil embargo that's been, laid down by the Americans in July of 1941. The clock is ticking, and the only
Mhm.
place they can get oil is from the southern resource area. So there you have it.
Dun, dun, dun.
Exactly.
We're setting it up. We're setting it
Yep.
up. So next week we're gonna do a little setup, if you will, from the United States perspective. And we're going to get to the
Yeah.
diplomatic road to Pearl Harbor. We're going to, what, in a couple weeks, I think it is.
Couple weeks.
Yeah, we're going
Have
to
our
have
buddy
Rich
Rich
on.
back. Yeah.
Rich will be with
Good.
us, and we're going to talk about the whole diplomatic road to Pearl, the oil embargo, and all that jazz. But before any of that happens, the United States and specifically FDR are preparing this country for war. And that's something we've talked about a lot. You don't just flip the light switch and everything comes on. It
Right.
doesn't work like that. There's preparations that need to be made. And I don't think a lot of people understand all the preparations that were made and the implications that they had. And we're going to get into that next week. So we're obviously setting the stage for the big attack, as it were.
Yeah.
So, John, anything else you want to add to
Yep.
this lively conversation this week?
Yeah. It's fun.
Excellent. Excellent. All right. Well, with that, we want to thank you very much for listening in on our conversation. Please give us a rating and review if you choose to do so. If you want to watch us on YouTube, you know where to look. If you have a question or a comment, we haven't gotten a lot lately, and I guess it's probably from my lack of response. And I do apologize again. I swear to God, I'm not ignoring you guys. I really am not, but it's just it's a lot to handle. It's a lot to handle at one time. So please, please, please forgive me, please. And if I send you a response that just says thanks or appreciate it, do know that I am actually reading it. I just don't have the time to write a dissertation.
And I'm in the
So,
same boat too. I've been getting them, since stepping into these shoes, and thank you everyone for being, accepting of me trying to fill Bill Tody's very large galoshes. But yeah, I've been getting a lot of email and more than I can answer, frankly. So I appreciate being here. And yeah, and I wish I could respond to the amount of email that I've been getting lately. So
yeah, yeah. So
anyway,
same here. So sorry, but we're reading them, but just might not get a response. So please
yep,
understand. So anyway, once again, I want to thank you very much for listening in or watching. My name is Seth Paridon. John, as always, my friend, thank you for being here with us.
appreciate it. Yep, and we'll see you all next week.